Welcome to In Such a Time, conversations on Jewish life, leadership, and meaning. Each week, Rabbis Jonathan Jaffe and Leora Londi explore the moments, questions, and ideas that shape who we are and who we aspire to be. And now, for this week's conversation.
Welcome back to In Such a Time. Today, Rabbi, you and I are going to be talking about this week's Parsha, in which we're recording the Parashat Shmini, and centering upon the story of Nadav and Avihu, and using this to ask the question about when does religiosity cross the line into zealotry, and is there ever a point in which religious practice, observance, or belief becomes dangerous? So first of all, hello, and Chag Sameach, as we're recording still amidst Passover, and just checking in with you, and maybe you want to tell us a little bit about the story of Nadav and Avihu to some of our listeners who may be less familiar with the story from the book of Leviticus.
So good to be here. Next time we record, it will be in person. But it's good that we have the technology to do this from afar. This Torah reading is one that really actually is quite moving and sad and powerful and a lesson. In the story of Nadav and Avihu is the following. Nadav and Avihu were two of the sons of Aaron, who was Moses' brother. He was the high priest. And immediately after they learn what it means to be priests, like they get this command and this explanation of what it means to be of the priesthood. Nadav and Avihu, two of the sons of Aaron, they go in to the Mishkan and they offer an alien fire before God. And they are immediately struck down by God. I don't know the grammar of that, and they're killed. And it's this awful, awful scene where these two guys who are so excited about, it seems so seemingly excited about becoming priests and learning what that means, out of a sense, there's a question out of a sense of excitement, they offer an extra offering to God, and God doesn't accept that offering because it's beyond the bounds of what they've been instructed to do. And immediately after, Aaron really has to function as the priest. That's in the parsha after. He has to function. He offers this first Yom Kippur of repenting for the collective sins, while also he's silent and mourning the death of his sons. And so it's this really tragic story about what happens when you're too moved, when there's too much passion around an idea, around ideology. And I think that the Torah is sending a really, really clear message about there are boundaries for our behavior, there are boundaries for our love of God. There are boundaries for everything that we do, and there's also consequences when we go outside the bounds of of what's acceptable. So yeah, it's a Torah reading that I come back to every single year, and I don't know, it's very gut-wrenching. Rabbi Jaffe, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree on the gut-wrenching nature of this. I think it's also notable that this is one of the only narratives in the entire book of Leviticus, that Sefer
Right.
Vayikra, as we call it in Hebrew, is almost entirely just law after law and different instructions around sacrifice and the priestly observance. And we stop for this story once the priests, Aaron's sons, are consecrated. And the first story we get is about this. I mean, I think we could read this in many different ways about zealousness. That's one message. Another message often taken of this is listening and following directions correctly. As this Eish Zara, what did this mean? This foreign or alien fire that's offered. There's a whole set of commentary to this around implicating Aaron, and perhaps that Nadav and Avihu are sort of sacrifices for Aaron's past sins, including participating in the building of the golden calf. The fact that one of their names is Nadav, or the given one, and the other one Abihu, literally "it's my father," points in this way. So there's a whole field day of commentators around that as well. I think the one that we really want to focus on here, as people who take religious observance very seriously and are helping to support a congregation and trying to encourage those congregants to participate more actively religiously in life, is to say, is there a breakpoint in which ever religious observance or religious belief becomes dangerous? And I remember teaching, I think it was our joint teacher, Michael Marmer, who once said it to me, that said that there are there are two kinds of dangerous people in the world. The one point kind of dangerous person is the person that says, I know exactly what God is. And if you don't
Yeah.
believe God in God the way that I absolutely know God to be, then you're dangerous and you're wrong. And the other person is on the other side of the spectrum to say, I am absolutely certain that there is no such thing as a God, and anyone who acts within accordance of an idea of God is irrational and is dangerous as well. And that where we want to be as religious leaders is in the gray space in between. The middle ground, as Judaism often finds itself, is to say, um, I'm not fundamentally certain about what God is or if God is, but I am engaged in the lifelong question and the lifelong search to that answer. And I should never become so arrogant as to think that where I have landed is the capital T truth, but is rather my personal truth. And not only that, but my personal truth will change throughout the course of my lifetime based upon how I encounter the world and how that affects my ideas of God. So how does that land on you, this idea of the safe space between these polar extremes and in this idea, casting sort of firm atheism as its own kind of religious zealotry?
I agree with that. I think that there's a lot of zealotry that falls into that category, like extreme vegan, extreme anything is something that scares me. Um, I'll speak personally, and I think that that's what we're doing here. I like to live in the doubt, and I I'm very allergic to anyone who thinks that they know what the truth is about anything. And I think all of us should be really um, keep that at bay. There's no such thing as knowing what truth is. Truth is a pursuit and it's a question. And anyone who says that they have an understanding, I wouldn't trust them by a mile. And I think that this text is showing us that Nadav and Avihu, I don't think that they're not villainous. They're not doing anything wrong. They're doing something out of love and out of passion. And as someone who can get swept up and be very, very passionate about things and maybe overly obsessed about things at times, um, I think that the Torah is giving us such an interesting allegory as to how we need to be in control of what bubbles up inside of us and how um, we can't allow ourselves to go too far with anything. We need to hold on to humility. We need to hold on to question. I love so much what Michael Marmer is saying there, that you have to it's a pursuit to try to keep yourself centered. You can't know that there's no God. You can't know that there's no God. You have to keep questioning, what do I know to be true? How do I know it to be true? What do others say? How can I fill myself with knowledge and keep on that journey? People who tell me, I mean, I have friends who are chaplains, and they tell me that when they go into a hospital room as Jews, and people of another religion tell them, I'm going to tell you the truth about God. And they have to be present there and they have to listen to that. And then also in their head, they're saying, how can you know what the truth about anything is? Especially God. Where do you get that from? But I think that there's also such a need sometimes to be, people who have hardship in their lives want to be swept away by grounding ideas. I mean, extremism comes from a place of often of desolate hope and wanting to hold on to something and root yourself in something.
Yeah, I think you and I both probably can count on experiences or people we know that really struggled with structure and with behavior and centeredness throughout their lives and were attracted towards
Mm.
fundamentalist expressions of religious practice as a way to offer them that structure. And that there are plenty of people who are, whether former, high school delinquents or hippies or whoever, who have found their way into the yeshiva world, and by the
Yeah, I was
way,
thinking that too.
into the monasteries and into the madrasas as well. It's not just both, this is not just a Jewish thing, but I think that there are often the type of people who are seeking structure, centering a sense of divine authority, that when they feel moments of loss are able to be pointed in the right direction and are allowed to somewhat abdicate their autonomy in the moment by saying that, well, God is good and everything is in God's hands, and I'm just an instrument of God. Um, and that can be very beautiful, by the way, for certain people, very healing and can provide purpose in their lives. I don't want to denigrate it completely. And I think, again, you and I both know people who are living really purposeful, driven lives within a more rigorous Orthodox framework. But I think there's always that fear that what happens then when your view of what is right for you becomes what is right for all. And I'll give you one example here, and I'm sure that you have many from Israel as well. So years ago, I'm at the overlook in the old city, overlooking the Kotel, the Western Wall, and it's Rosh Chodesh, and it's a day of Nashot HaKotel. It's a day of the women of the wall who are coming to pray at the wall and try to attempt to read Torah at the wall, or talit, to practice
For the
fully
first of the month.
uh, on the first of the month. Thank you. And I'm up above at the plaza, and there's an Orthodox woman standing there. And she says to me, she's a recent recent immigrant from, I think she was from New Jersey somewhere. She says to me, "Can you believe this? Can you believe what they're doing?" And I don't know which side she's on, right? So I just look at her like, yeah, like, wow, what's going on here? And she basically makes the point to me saying, don't these women realize that by their actions, they are endangering the security of the land of Israel? That our
Mm.
prophets and the Torah shows us that when we follow the mitzvot, God protects us. And when we do not, then God allows our enemies to destroy us. And these women are blaspheming God by not adhering to the strict observance of the law, and that they are actually a threat against my life. And when you see the world that way, that someone's religious practice is not just something that is onerous to you or is offensive to you, but is actually a moral threat to your well-being, then in your mind, that gives you the right to do anything that you need to do in order to stop that person, including within religious observance, killing someone. Um, and in that moment, standing with her, I didn't, of course, have this argument. I was like, wow, that's interesting. And I walked away. And it was really, for me, a very challenging moment because I don't know how to respond to that. And again, for me, encountering Jewish extremism was such a foreign experience. It has become less and less foreign the more time I spend in Israel. And again, I turn to you for this, but an eye-opening one. So, how about you, having spent significant time there?
You have me thinking for a second about what I was accused of being in Israel. I there were moments where I was one of the women at the wall, and I spent a lot of my time in Israel advocating for equality and egalitarianism, and I was called an extremist all the time by the orthodoxy, by the establishment. They would say, "You Reform Jews, you are um, desecrating the tradition, you're desecrating the Torah, you are such extremists. That you take this idea that you're so arrogant that you're changing what the Torah says, and how dare you?" And I spent a lot
Hmm.
of time thinking about that. Like, is my liberalism, is my egalitarianism, is that an extreme value? And so I think that it's really important that we're always questioning when we think that we're grounded in doubt, and we're grounded in open-minded thinking. Is that open-minded thinking, is that extreme? Is that is that the deviation? I don't know. I don't think I'm such an extremist, but perhaps if you're looking at yourself as a Jew within the confines of Jewish law, we make choices that are pretty extreme. So I think that everything's kind of relative. Like, do you know what I'm saying? That yeah.
I do. And if you see the world this way, then you might, Leora, you might say, well, that's fine because I'm going to have my egalitarian space and you can have your Orthodox space, and I'm not going to threaten your space. And that way it's equality and everyone gets their own. But I think to someone coming from that mindset, that's like saying, well, we're going to live in the same world and I'm going to pollute my half of the world and you don't have to pollute your half of the world and we're going to be fine. Because the argument then is, of course, well, your pollution affects me. And for someone who
Mhm.
sees the world this way, to say that by going against the traditional understanding of halakha, of Jewish law, it's not just that you're going to be hurting yourself, but that all of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel and Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, are judged as a collective. And so your pollution is affecting my world. And that's a
Well
hard
said.
thing to, right? It's a very hard thing to create balance or to compromise with someone who sees the world that way.
Yeah, that holds heavy for me because I think that this is such a this Torah reading is really, we all think that the other side is extreme. We all think that the other, whoever doesn't have our values or takes it to a different level of passion, they're the extreme ones. But we forget that, Reform Judaism, even though it's the majority in America at this point, that it's a new practice. Living Jewish life outside of Jewish law is a new practice. And so um, even though I think some of our community would say, we do Judaism light, which I hate, but that in itself is extreme. And so I think I'm working it out loud right now. Like, have we deviated from have we deviated and gone to an extreme level? Um, are we doing too much of a good thing? We do Judaism, but maybe sometimes without the binding nature of it. Maybe that's the essence of Judaism. And we say maybe it's an extreme idea to say, well, we could do that. We could live Judaism without mitzvah. And so I'm looking at myself right now as a Nadav and Avihu moment, that they were struck down by God, but maybe we're striking ourselves out by not holding on to certain things, by maybe being overly zealous in our ability to kind of push things out of the way.
Right. And I would say that there's two things the reform movement did that I think can be interpreted as extreme by those coming from a more orthodox perspective. And each of these could be their own podcast, so I don't want to weigh too heavily into each. The
Yeah, don't do
first
that.
one, the first one was recognizing patrilineal descent, meaning
Right.
that now, that patrilineal descent meaning that a child of a Jewish father but a non-Jewish mother, the Reform movement, as of I think it was 1973, classified or clarified as being Jewish, which means that someone who comes to a Reform synagogue meets someone from an Orthodox synagogue, the person from the Orthodox synagogue can't be sure that that person is actually Jewish according to their same terms. That was one. And number two, was to create Batei Din, was to create conversions and conversion courts, which did not mandate that someone live a halakhic life in order to convert to Judaism. And both of those are extreme because, again, whereas in the past you could say, well, this person's maybe a less observant or even a quote unquote bad Jew, those two moves made it so that an Orthodox Jew could no longer be sure that someone who introduced themselves as a Reform Jew was actually even Jewish at all, according to their definition. And I think that that breach, I think, has had much wider ramifications than I think many of us as Reform Jews take into account. And I think,
Hmm.
again, in our own humility, we ought to be aware of that, cognizant of what a break that was. And for those coming from a traditional background, just how extreme or zealotry those moves were.
I'm gonna take us. We jump. We're jumpers here. I'm gonna take us back just to the text for a second, and I think that one of most of the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, is about korbanot, is about sacrifice. And we talked about this in previous podcasts, that the root of the word korban is karov. It's closeness. And I think that that's what zealotry and extremism is. It's about, how do I become closer to something? How do I become closer to the divine? How do I become closer to God? And so when Nadav and Avihu are going past the limit, it's not necessarily rebellion, but they're overly passionate. They're not disciplined enough. Um, they're certain where they should be humble. They're impulsive where they should be part of a structure. Um, and they do this all in the pursuit of God, all in the pursuit of loving God. But I think that looking at myself as a Jew, so much of what I do, I do out of passion and love for our tradition. But I think that everything has to be grounded and everything has to be structured and everything has to be um, maybe a little bit more disciplined. And I think that that's what this story is trying to teach us, that you can try to get close to something, but you need to do it in a way that has boundaries. And I think that's basically the whole book of Vayikra is everything is about boundaries. Everything's about not what you do, but how you do it. Um, and so I think that that's really sitting with me right now is, how what do you first of all, I think that it's important to understand why extremists do what they do. When we talk about, fundamental extremists who are terrorizing our world, I think a lot of the reason that they do what they do is because they have a sense of truth and love for God, and um, they're overly clear about what they think God wants, and that's terrifying. But I think all of it comes from like this need for deep intimacy, and I think that that's something that we need, that it's a warning. Don't ever don't ever breach the boundaries of what closeness can be. And so I think that I'm maybe like a little associative with this right now. But I'm just so fascinated by these characters who are literally killed um, for trying to do something that they thought that they were moved and so passionate to do. And I just think it's such a reminder of, kind of staying in our own lanes and not thinking that we know the answers to everything.
So it's interesting to me that the thing that you are saying that you are afraid of or most anxious over participating is the exact definition of dvekut, of the
Yes.
of the Hasidic Kabbalistic idea. Dveikut means like literally like stickingness to God, but it really means like merging with God. And the
Mhm.
definition Kabbalistically is to remove the barriers between you and God and to create a complete and total wholeness and connection with God that is unhindered by any sort of barrier or blockage within this world. It is exactly what you are talking about as your greatest fear is the greatest goal within that religious mindset. And I wonder
It's
how
a
you
fine
deal with
line.
that. So speaking of fine line, I want to try working this more. So the story of Nadav and Avihu is interestingly similar to the story of Elijah and the priests at Baal. And at
Right.
that story of the priests of Baal, comes from within Nevi'im prophets. It's also the story that we it's also the Haftarah for I think it's for if it's when the sacrifices are first given. I'm going to get to when the Haftarah is. It's also the closing words of Yom Kippur of Adonai Hu Elohim. Um,
Yeah.
God is our God, Adonai is our God. The story is that Elijah orders a contest against the priests of Baal, these foreign priests who are bowing to a idol, to the god of Baal, which was very prominent within the Middle Eastern world. Um, I believe within Assyria, you can correct me on that, and and challenges them. And they both put out their fire pans, just like Nadav and Abihu did, and they both kind of say their prayers over it and call upon God, and nothing happens to the priests of Baal. And then not only does Elijah put out his sacrifice, but pours water on it just to show that, it's really going to be hard to light. And then calls out, and then fire comes down and strikes and ignites the sacrifice. Both of the stories have a sacrifice being offered and fire coming down and striking it in a very public way in order to teach a lesson. One could read the story of Elijah as a prophetic repudiation of the Nadav and Abihu story, as the Tanakh often comments and folds upon itself. And I wonder if the story of Elijah calling and sort of disgracing, embarrassing the priests of Baal is gives fodder to those who believe that their truth should reign supreme and that God does want us to pursue absolute truths. What do you do with that story, Rabbi?
Oh. Um, well, I think that these stories are complementary because it's saying even within the Israelite Jewish Hebrew tradition, you can't don't think that you know more. Don't think that you have a truth that is more truthful than the than truth. Um, and what also with beyond the tradition, you can't replace, you can't bring outside traditions or outside ideas into it. I mean, I think that the character of God and the concept of truth kind of are separated in my mind. I think the character of God is trying to establish this is I am all powerful. I'm talking about like the biblical narrative character of God. I am all powerful, not me, not Leora. God, I'm also very powerful. I am all powerful. These are the boundaries. I've created this structure for you. Um, you are an unstructured people. You're Kishley Olaf. You're a pain in my neck, literally. You're stiff-necked people. And you need to do what I'm saying and stop thinking that you know better because you're going to get a whack in the face, or you're going to be struck dead because you're without what you're beyond the bounds of it. So once the people of Israel learn what the rules are within the camp, within the tribe, then they're also learning how they interact with outside nations. And it's I think it's a push and pull all the time. You're going to be enticed. You're going to see things that are interesting. You're going to see things that maybe are more appealing, more popular. But you need to stay on the track. So that's one idea. That's the character of God. Then I think it's the idea of God in truth. Like I think that you and I maybe interchangeably might use. I'm speaking. I'm assuming. I shouldn't assume, but um, that you and I might use the words truth and God interchangeably in some way, like to believe in God is like the pursuit of truth in the world and the pursuit of this idea of like there is one universe and there's this idea of oneness. And so I don't think that those things are necessarily, I think that we're dealing with like a characterization in a story, and we're also dealing with this idea of truth in general. And I think that they're intertwined with one another. But I think that the stories are trying to teach us that there's a lot of things that are going to be interesting for you and there's a lot of ways that you're going to want to express yourself, but if you want to be a part of a people, if you want to be a part of this nation, if you want to be a part of an ethical tradition, then you need to stay on a certain path and you will deviate, you will get off, but then you need to return. um what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the commonality between the Muslim suicide terrorist and the Jewish West Bank extreme
Mm.
settler who terrorizes and kills Palestinian, largely Bedouin populations, both of them believe that God is on their side. Literally the word Emmanuel, right? God is with us. And that what they are doing is ultimately the sanctification of God's name. And here we come to another Torah narrative, if I can, and this is to explain to our listeners why there are no Reformed Jews named Pinchas, but why you find only Orthodox Jews and settlers named Pinchas. Pinchas is a story from the Torah. It's in the book of Numbers in Bamidbar, in which a Israelite man and a Moabite woman are cohabitating in the temple, and Pinchas takes a spear and kills both of them as they are together, and is awarded as God a brit shalom, a not just an award, but as a covenant of peace for what Pinchas has done. And this is something that we don't teach very often in Reformed context because it seems to be an endorsement, once again, of zealotry and taking lives in the name of God. And so we have these things in our text. And I think that you can look at the Torah, the New Testament for Christians, the Quran, and you could find extremist sections in all of them. There's dangerous things in all of them. The thing is, for us as Jews, is that we don't have any Jebusites, Canaanites, Amorites around these days to point out and say, look at all the terrible things you're saying about us. And you're saying that if you turn and follow our gods, then you should be killed. Um, this is what both the Quran and the New Testament at times say about Jews. And so we are able to sort of wiggle out of it or not. We don't talk about it as much because it's not as relevant because though, as Maimonides would say, Amalek no longer exists. Those people are not around anymore, so we don't have to pay heed to that more extreme section of our history. Um, but it brings me to a question, if I can share with you, Rabbi. Is it okay if I turn to a little pivot here? When we're talking about religious extremism, we often frame it in the word calling something a cult, like the Branch
Mhm.
Davidians and David Koresh is a cult. Um, but all a cult is a religion that has not yet received enough mass endorsement in order to be taken seriously. Every religion begins as a cult, right? Jews began as a cult. And then within Judaism, this cult of those who believed that Jesus was God and that negated the 613 mitzvot was a cult. And then there was a
Wait, wait.
cult that came, right? That everything starts as a cult
Wait, can
and
I
then,
stop you for a second? Can you
please,
expand on that? I think that that's really important. I mean, rabbinic Judaism, second century, you're gonna say this, but second century Judaism was the time of the cults. The temple in Jerusalem was failing. It became quite corrupt, and all these cults arose, including the Pharisees, rabbinic Jews. Okay, continue. I'm sorry.
no, you're doing a great job. Please, no, I was talking for enough
No,
there.
so
Yes.
the rabbis, the Pharisees, came out of this period where they had to kind of reinvent the wheel. They saw that the establishment wasn't working, and I mean Judaism has always been countercultural and really anti-establishment, and that's I think one of the secrets and one of the really interesting things about it is that it was countercultural. Like the establishment was failing, and they said, okay, how do we either reinvent this or we're gonna fail. And so the dialectical tradition um, became, which we're a part of, the commentary on the Torah, trying to figure out how to live a life um, of Jewish law-based practice in a world where a temple was about not to exist. That's where we came from, and that's kind of what stuck.
Right. And everything from, let's say, Paul until Constantine was a cult until this mass endorsement and this establishment of a church of Christianity. The same thing for the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, that this began as something very small. That Muhammad spoke to the Jews of Medina and offered this to them, and it was rejected. But eventually it swept across the known Middle East now and became established as one of the major religions of the world. You can see this even today. We are at a point now where you could say maybe 100 years ago, Mormonism would be considered a cult, but it has established itself to the point where it's seen as a valid religion, whereas Scientology is not yet there and is still seen as rather cultish, right? So everything begins as you could say, as extreme expression, and through time, both receives endorsement and often matures to it in a less extreme way in order to become more widely accepted. I think that's fair to say. I think that and Judaism certainly by the fact of diasporic existence and again having to worry about what would the neighbors say, that we would right that it was something that modified our own more extreme impulses in a way that they are not being at all. That's not happening at all in Israel in certain pockets of vast extremism that you can see there. So I wonder when we talk about these things, who are we to point the fingers and call something cultish or extreme behavior when that was once us? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say. I think that's one of the terrifying things about organized religion, um, is that, we convince ourselves that there's normality in it. Um, but you have to buy into it. And I'm always skeptical of anything that I have to buy into, on the one hand. On the other hand, I became a rabbi.
Right. I think another trend you can see historically is that when things in the world seem most hopeless is when messianic fervor most presents
Yes.
itself. And here, the time of first century Israel and the Roman invasion and all of this infighting between these different sects of Judaism, that of course there were messianic aspirations. Jesus was not the only messianic figure to arise during the time. But for example, Bar Kokhba in the 135 CE, the revolt under Bar Kokhba, endorsed by Rabbi
Shabtai
Akiva,
Tzvi.
right, is a cultish figure as well. Or I give you another one from Jewish history. I have to go back and check my notes after this, but I believe it's the 1600s is the time of Shabbatai Tzvi,
Yeah, yeah.
who declares himself the Messiah of the Jews and receives, you know, worldwide acceptance by the Jewish diaspora that the end of days is coming and Shabbatai Tzvi is going to lead to the Messiah coming at this time. Whenever there's mass confusion and suffering and feeling as though the world is going in the wrong direction, extreme and often messianic the feelings arise. The Haftarah that we read during the Shalosh Regalim, the three festivals, all is this messianic dream of this final battle between God and Gog and Magog, these sort of counter
Yeah.
gods, these false gods that God will triumph over. It reads like, the end of Ghostbusters with with fire and lightning and doom and the world turning over. And it's because when people would come to the temple in Jerusalem and they would see something like this temple, something they'd never seen before, and all of these people, they would be swept up in messianic vigor and they would dream about an end of days. And I think that, especially nowadays, when you see conspiracy theories arise and people often lose hope and feel as though the world is going in the wrong direction, you also see messianic and more extreme religious views arise. And I think that that is a symptom of the times and something that we ought to be wary of.
It's interesting though. People look at I don't want to say cults. They look at sex, that SECTS, as that was important, as something that has authenticity. And so a lot of people in this world right now, in the Jewish world, are really moved by Chabad, um, which is very much a sect of Orthodox Judaism that has an element of Messianism in it. And people are so comforted by it because it's and I love I'm a fan of what Chabad does. Um I'm not Chabad myself, and I'm not going to critique it, but I think it's so interesting that there's such a high tolerance and threshold for that kind of Jewish practice because people see that as legitimate. People see that as warming, and the outreach just makes them feel good. But if it were a different religion, they might feel really uncomfortable with it. So I think that it's interesting the nuance of what we tolerate and have an appetite for.
I actually think that Chabad is a really nice place for us to land with this because I think that it is such a useful model of a religious group that has been able to maintain its own religious standards while at the same time offering great inclusivity to those who don't abide by the same standards and not judging them. When someone
Mhm.
goes to Chabad, when my daughter goes to Chabad on campus, they don't tell her not to sing because you shouldn't be hearing a woman's voice. They don't tell her to cover her hair. They don't judge. There are girls that come to Chabad completely inappropriately dressed and they don't yell at them. They don't make them wear robes on top. They welcome everyone as they are. They try to model for others the life that they think is the appropriate life to live, but they do so without foisting that, or requiring that on others. And I think that that's a really interesting and helpful middle ground. I think whereas the reform movement went in the opposite direction to say, we are going to change our observances to be as inclusive to make sure that anyone who wants to participate Jewishly can do so. And we're not going to mandate, we're not going to require anything of them. Um, that Chabad is saying, no, we're going to actually stick to our principles, but we're going to welcome anyone in who wants to be with us as we practice Judaism the way that we see fit. So, for example, at a Chabad Seder, I think the one at University of Maryland went for around 3 hours. Chabad did not say we're going to make a 20-minute Seder because we know that our kids here aren't used to a long one. They said, no, we're going to do the Seder the way that we think it's fit to do Seder, but we're going to make sure that it's inclusive and welcoming and fun, and anyone can come when they want to come, and anyone can leave when they want to come because we're just doing our thing. I think that's a really helpful idea of a middle ground.
Yes. And it's also easy to find, and again, this is not a critique. This is what I'm noticing is that when people are authentically themselves, it's really, really contagious. And so when Chabad doesn't pretend to be anything that it's not, they say what their mission is. We want to make Jews more Jewish in a very serious and real way, but with no judgment. It's easier to find yourself in a place like that when you're being made to feel warm and welcome. But I wonder if there's an element of extremism there as well. Um, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it just we should probably wrap up here just thinking that this is I think the dialectic that we are stuck between is this idea of how do we on one hand model an authentic religious practice and expression without foisting it upon others, but rather beckoning and inviting them to do more. I think it was Franz Rosenzweig who said that, when asked, "Did you do the 613 mitzvot?" He said, "Not yet."
Not
That the
yet. It's
idea
fill-in.
that to fill it, that the idea that there are there are all of these observances, and all of us throughout our lives are embarking on this journey, and that we shouldn't judge anyone for where they currently find themselves observantly, but we should always have an invitation there to help to bring along anyone who would like to explore and to deepen their religious practice, which I think is at the core of what we do here at Bethel.
I agree. So I think that perhaps our charge this week for Parashat Shmini is, you know, it's important to lean into your passions and it's important to be moved and to be swept up in this world. But I think that what you identified, um, dveikut, the clinginess to God and the clinginess to an idea and to passion, that's something that needs to be held bamidah, like it needs to be held with measurement. And anything that's too much is dangerous. Anything that's too little is dangerous. It's important that we find somewhere in the middle, in everything that we do, Judaism and life.
You remind me of a critique, if I can, of Maimonides. Maimonides often teaches the golden mean, and to say that and he takes this directly from Aristotle, the way to live our life is, not to eat too much, not to eat too little, not to sleep too much, not to sleep too little, not to have conjugal relations too much, not to have it too little, and on and on. And the critique of this is that sounds great, but you can't tell me that, you shouldn't do child abuse a little and childish too much. Like there's one thing you can never say there's a golden mean with murder, right? That there are certain things that you have to say that no, that the correct way to act is to do zero of that or all of that. And it's hard to tell people which are the things that they should practice the golden mean and which are the certain things in which we should hedge to the extremes.
Hmm.
It's a tough one.
It's a tough one. It's such a good story, and I'm really happy that we had the opportunity to discuss it.
So, inviting all of our congregants as well, if you want to continue these discussions around with us, but whether it's in terms of religious observance, avoiding extremism, but at the same time being authentic to ourselves, that we hope in you listening to these podcasts and being in conversation with us, that this conversation continues.
Amen.
Thanks. Chag Sameach.
Thanks for joining us on In Such a Time. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. To learn more about Rabbis Jonathan Jaffe and Leora Londi, or to connect with Temple Bethel of Northern Westchester, visit bethelnw.org, or follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Temple Bethel NW. Thanks for listening.